What's going on, everybody? TL Branson here, and today we're going to be talking about the best Shadow and Bone series reading order. Thanks for watching. You're tuned in to YA Fantasy Addicts, the place where we talk about all things YA fantasy. If you'd like to see more content like this, go ahead and hit the like and subscribe button so you can be notified the next time that we post new content. With Shadow and Bone set to release to Netflix in the next few months, I've noticed a huge uptick in questions about Shadow and Bone in the YA Fantasy Addicts Facebook group, specifically on what order should you read them if you're new to the series. Well, your wish is my command. Today, we're going to be talking about the best way to read the Leigh Bardugo books. The Shadow and Bone series, or better known as the Grishaverse, is pretty straightforward. You should read the books in publication order if you want the best possible arc for the series. But the Grishaverse books were specifically written so that you could jump in at any point logically and be okay. You want to start with King of Scars? Go for it. You want to start with Shadow of Bone? Fantastic. Six of Crows? You got it. How about Language of Thorns? You can start there too. So many different jumping on points for the Grishaverse, it really doesn't matter where you begin. But what's the best reading order? Personally, I would start at the very beginning. I would recommend reading the Grishaverse the way thousands of fans did, and that's in the order in which the books were published. But before we jump in, let's talk a little bit about what is the Grishaverse. The Grishaverse is Leigh Bardugo's Russian-inspired fantasy world, where the magic users are called Grishas. Beginning with Shadow and Bone, you'll meet Alina Starkov, who is our typical heroine that we look for in YA fantasy. Stepping over to Six of Crows, we'll go to Ketterdam and meet Kaz Brecker, a man with a criminal past who puts together a crew of 6 people for the greatest heist of the century. Little does he know that the only thing standing between his enemies and the destruction of the world is him and his crew. It's these and several other stories that make up the Grishaverse, and these characters are who we'll be meeting when Shadow and Bone hits Netflix in April. So let's take a quick drill down through the Shadow and Bone series in publication order so that you can see the best way to read them. First up is Shadow and Bone, published in 2012. Next we have Siege and Storm, published in 2013. Then Ruin and Rising, published in 2014. In 2015, a short story called The Demon in the Woods was published. Most people aren't aware of this story, but it is the prequel for Shadow and Bone and details the life of the Darkling when he was just a boy. You can only get this book in ebook form, and I'll go ahead and put a link down to all of these books in the comments so that you don't have to go hunting for them if you want to learn more about them. After the Shadow and Bone trilogy, we have the Six of Crows duology, starting with Six of Crows, published in 2015, and Crooked Kingdom, published in 2016. Next up, we have a standalone, which is the Language of Thorns, published in 2017. This is a collection of short stories that have nothing to do with any of the other series, so it's a good jumping on point if you'd like to read something short and quick. After that is the King of Scars duology, beginning with King of Scars, published in 2019, and Rule of Wolves, which is set to publish at the end of March in 2021. There is one final book that you might consider, and it's called The Lives of Saints. This is a companion book to the Shadow and Bone trilogy and is actually a book that Alina Starkov has inside the book. It is illustrated and provides more information about the Grishaverse and the lore of the world. Let's go through a few frequently asked questions. First up, should I start with Shadow and Bone or Six of Crows? Well, personally, I think you should start with Shadow and Bone. You can imagine that it is going to have the most information for getting you acquainted with the world. On top of that, every author continues to improve with their writing, and if you start with one of the later books, you may be disappointed by going back to Shadow and Bone. That doesn't mean that Shadow and Bone is not a good book. It's a fantastic book. But think about popular series like Throne of Glass. It's no surprise that the last few books in the Throne of Glass series are better than the first few books. Authors improve with time, and so I think you should start with Shadow and Bone because it is one of the most logical places to start. But could you start with Six of Crows? If you find yourself being easily bored with Shadow and Bone, go ahead and start with Six of Crows. And it is by far the most popular book in the Grishaverse according to YA Fantasy Addicts. When should I read Language of Thorns? Well, it was published after the Six of Crows duology, so that might be the most logical place to put it, just to keep everything in the order that they were published. But you can read it whenever. If you'd like to read it first, go for it. You want to read it after Shadow and Bone? Be my guest. Do whatever you want. Language of Thorns is designed not to coincide with any of the other series, so read it when you feel like it. Why did you put a prequel after Book 3? I put The Demon in the Woods in publication order because from what I've read, it really would help if you knew who the Darkling was before you began that book. Yes, it's a prequel. Yes, chronologically it takes place before Shadow and Bone. It takes place when the Darkling was a little boy. But if you don't know anything about the Darkling, it won't have as big of an impact on you. So at the very least, I would recommend saving it until after Book 1, but the most logical place is to read it when the author wrote it, which is after Ruin and Rising. And there you have it, a quick rundown of the reading order of the books in the Grishaverse and a few frequently asked questions. Do you have a question I didn't answer? Go ahead and drop it down in the comments and I'll be happy to get back with you. Also, feel free to join us at YA Fantasy Addicts on Facebook at facebook.com/groups/YA Fantasy Addicts. I'll go ahead and put a link down in the description as well. If you meet us there, you can join 33,000 other YA fantasy fans who are also talking about Shadow and Bone. Once again, hit the like and subscribe button if you want to see more content like this, and we'll catch you again next time.